So in the last couple of days, I've posted a couple of videos talking about the camera on the Galaxy S23 Ultra. And in those videos, I refrained from using the 50 megapixel or 200 megapixel modes with that camera. And a lot of people have since commented and said, why didn't you use those modes? That could have been a way to make the pictures even better for these tests, so that when you're comparing it to the Pixel, you're comparing it to the Z Fold 4, perhaps using those modes would have given the S23 Ultra an added benefit or an added advantage. So in this video, what I'm going to do is we're going to look at a series of images that were taken first using 12 megapixels, then 50, then 200, and we're going to try to answer as definitively as we can, should you be using those modes on your S23 Ultra? And if so, when does it make the most sense? What are the downsides to using it? And hopefully through this, I'm going to kind of answer why I did not use those modes in those camera tests. So let's jump into the first one first, as that is usually a very good place to start. So we're looking just over my shoulder at the wall that is visible in most of these shots. And this is, again, 12 megapixels, and everything looks pretty decent. If you zoom in here, this is as far as I'm able to zoom in on Google Photos, and I think everything is still, relatively detailed. We can read Martin established, it was 1833, I think is what that says. Great, whatever. This is a fine picture, and notice in particular the exposure on this lamp over here. So let's go to 50 megapixels, and I think what you're going to notice here is that it is very, very bright. And the exposure on this lamp is atrocious. It's really, really bad. So let's zoom in. And as you can see, yes, indeed, we can zoom in much further. This text is probably a little bit more legible, right? Maybe the text over here is a bit more legible, but the exposure is really bad, okay? Which is a better shot? Well, I think, yeah, okay, great. I can zoom in further, but the exposure is terrible. If I go to the 200 megapixel, once again, yes, I can zoom in much further, and once this clears up, as this is a really large image, yeah, okay, I can see more detail probably there, as well, but again, the exposure's bad, so why would I use this? To me, this is clearly the better image. The 12 megapixel, I think, overall is the better picture. Let's move to the next one. So again, starting at 12 megapixel, let's zoom in, and we'll use the barcode here. I think that'll be a good way to try and see if we can resolve any more detail going up. So if we go to the next one, again, the exposure. Anytime there's any bright source of light, look at the LEDs before and after. They're just overexposed. So yeah, let's zoom in as far as we can. Can we read any more? Can we make out any more of that? Maybe a bit more. Going to the 200 megapixel, the same thing. The exposure is really bad. Let's zoom in all the way, and yeah, we can probably make out some additional detail there. We can almost see individual lines fairly clearly, but again, the exposure is terrible. So the 12 is still the better picture. Now this one I think is a bit more evenly lit. This is a probably just a really nice lighting to take a photo with anyways. And this is an instance where it kind of makes sense to use these higher resolution modes. Let's zoom in here on the plant. And yeah, I mean, this is still a nicely detailed shot. Are we going to see any change in the amount of grain that is visible here? Perhaps. Let's jump forward and see. So 50 megapixel. Okay, so the color is definitely, I think, warmer on the 200 megapixel mode. Am I crazy? That definitely looks warmer to me. We can zoom in a bit further. And I think that there actually is less grain, which is interesting to see. And on 200 megapixels, it looks very similar to the 50. But of course, we can zoom in just ridiculously far, let that clear up. And yeah, okay. So in this instance, with what I would call pretty even, pretty good lighting, on a still subject, I think it can make some sense. However, for the purposes of what most people are doing, is it worth switching over to these modes? Because you're not going to be leaving it on these modes full time, because it's going to mess up your exposure in a lot of pictures. You have to manually switch to this. Is it worth switching to it in situations like this? Yeah, sure, go for it. You might be able to, if you pixel peep and zoom way in, you're going to be able to tell that that's an improved image. But when you first look at it, it's warmer, and that's really about it. And that's going to come down to personal preference. This is actually the more accurate shot. But if you want a little bit less grain and maybe a warmer image, and it's a still subject, and it's well lit, sure, switch over to it. Stepping outside, again, this is an overcast day. We'll zoom in on the tree here. What kind of detail is resolved in the bark? Let's look at the color of the leaves. Let's look at the color of the barn. And now let's go to the 50. Let's zoom in. The leaves do look a bit lighter in color. So again, this is kind of a trend that we have here. For some reason, it's lightening up some of these things, changing the color tone a little bit. Color there on the barn. Jumping over to the 200 megapixel, and the 200 actually looks more similar to the first one. The leaves are darker again. They're more muted again. The detail that we can zoom way in on is, I mean, yeah, sure, it's probably a little bit better. The color over here is more muted, more similar to the first image as well. So a little bit of inconsistency. Actually, that's more muted than the first one. So if you're going to go from, color saturation, you go most is 50, second is 12, and then least is 200 by a pretty good margin. So interesting how it's exposing differently. Again, a still subject, good lighting. If you want to switch to it, go for it. And of course, there is one more big reason why I don't really use these modes. Let me show you this video here as we move forward. And what I'm about to do in this picture is I'm going to take a picture with standard, switch to 50, take a picture. Notice how long that takes. Look at the spinning thing over here. Switch to 200, take a picture. Notice how long that takes. And now we're going to switch over and watch how long it takes us to process, which that's not super important because you can keep snapping pictures. But I thought it would still be valuable to show you guys how long it takes to actually process this image when you're shooting at that mode, which it took a while. Now we're back on standard mode. I'm going to take pictures as quickly as I can. Look how quickly I can fire off these images. Let's switch to 200. How quickly can you get these images off? You've really got to take your time between these shots. So all in all, yes, these modes can resolve more detail when you zoom way in. But in my opinion, from the other testing that I've done, plus these samples I just took 10 minutes ago, more often than not, your best overall shot in terms of exposure, in terms of blur, because your shutter is just going to be quicker, in terms of accurate colors, are taken at the default mode. Samsung, of course, is going to have the mode it comes with is going to be your all-around best shooter. So yes, in certain situations with good lighting on still subjects, if you want to switch over and use that, you are going to get more detail. But then I ask you, what are you doing with that more detail? Maybe you're going to crop in afterwards and reframe the shot. I guess that would be a cool thing you could do. But wherever you're posting it, it's not going to be there anymore once it's posted. So what I would recommend is for most people, most of the time, just leave it on the default. You're going to be better off leaving it there 99% of the time. Switch over when you think there's a really good reason to do so. And you're probably going to want to take a shot at the standard mode too, just in case, because it might end up being the better shot at the end of the day regardless. So guys, that's kind of my reasoning, and that's also hopefully going to be a good way to answer the question, should you be using the 50 megapixel or 200 megapixel mode? And if so, when should you use it? What should you expect? Hopefully this information was beneficial to some of you out there, and that question is fairly well answered. Guys, hit that subscribe button before you go so you don't miss out on more content like this. And until next time, stay nerdy, my friends.